Now we're going to create a scene that's a little bit in more shallow water, and we're going to be creating some light beams using volumetric lighting and having those match up to the movement of our water. So we're going to start out by adding in a cylinder, which we're going to be using basically as our ocean volume. I'm going to squish this down a little. We just want to scale this up using our size gizmo, just to make sure we have enough volume in the scene for our water. And just move that down. We don't want to make it too high, and I might need to scale that out a little bit more, but right now we'll go ahead and just add in one of our water surfaces. So we'll load in a material, select liquids, and just go with our default water to begin with. We'll double click on that material, and now I'm going to go to the Bumps tab, right mouse click and go to Edit Function. I'm going to delete our bump that we currently have on there and add in a new fractal and change that to Open Ocean. And I'm going to keep all of our default settings for now. And if we go back, we can see our bump. We have a depth set to 0.2. Well, I'm going to change this to 2. And then our bump scale, we'll bring all the way down to 1, just so that it's uniform. And now I just want to take a look at this above the surface of our water, just to get an idea of whether or not that bump amount of 2 is going to be enough. Right mouse click on our camera, just want to render out a quick preview. Render to screen. I'm also going to change this to 16 by 9, set this to 800 by 450, and we can render this out and take a look at our water so far from above the surface. And we may need to increase that bump just a little bit more, so I'll go ahead and increase that depth to 3, and I'm going to go to our atmosphere editor and just raise up the pitch so that we have more of a daylight sky. You can take a look at a render for this. And that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and close that out. And now we need to make a couple of modifications to our sky, just so that we can see the depth in our water. Go to the atmosphere editor, under Sky, Fog, and Haze, remove our aerial perspective. And I'm also going to remove our haze at the moment. And we can see that light area like we were talking about in the first part of this tutorial. So we can set a haze color for that and modify it. We can also make a couple other adjustments. I'm going to go to the numeric cylinder options, go to size, and I'm going to change our X and Y to 4000. And we'll be making more modifications to our overall depth in the water a little bit later. But first what I want to do is just focus on the light beams and the shallower areas of our water. We can just kind of look up, and we just want to see a bit of that sun showing through. And I'm going to use the camera focal, which is just above our move option for our camera, and give us more of a wide angle lens. And with this specific shot, we're really not going to have to worry about that overall depth, which is one reason why I'm not really focusing on it too much right now. I just want to stick with the area we're working on. And now what I want to do is also adjust our sun's rotation around the scene, and just adjust the azimuth. And maybe I'll bring our pitch down a little bit more. And that should be a good starting point for what we're going to be doing here. We are going to add in a spotlight. So we'll go ahead and click to add that in. And what I want to do is just kind of match this up to the rotation of our sunlight, and that way, because this is going to be our volumetric light that's casting the rays, we have something that matches up fairly close to where the sun actually is. And of course we are going to have to make some adjustments to this light depending on where we're at in the scene. But we can start with this for right now. And what I want to do is use our spotlight in the first tab and just increase our spread. So we have about 40%. I can increase that a little bit more to about 45. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on volumetric lighting. I'm just going to left mouse click on this volumetric option, right mouse click on it, and go to Edit Volumetric Settings. And now we have Cast Shadow and Volume, which we want on. And with our intensity, I'm just going to leave all of this just at the default for right now. If we render this out, we're just going to see very basic volumetric light, but no shadows are really being cast by this water. And the reason for that is because we are actually inside of the volume. So we need to use another object in order to cast these shadows into our water. And there's a really easy way of doing this. And basically what I want to do is just create a cylinder. And I just want to scale this up and just create sort of a thin disk. And we're going to be placing this in front of our light and applying a material to it with a bit of transparency in order to block that light in the correct areas. So we'll just place this in front of our spotlight, making sure that we're covering up all of our areas. And right now it has a water surface on it, which is going to be the same as our cylinder, but we need to change that. And what I want to do is just reset this back to our default surface, which we can do by loading in under Rocks our first material, which is the default. And now we can see that that has disappeared in our scene, and all of our volumetric light is now being blocked by this object. So what we want to do is create an object that has transparency to it, and that matches up to our water. And we can do this really easily. I'm going to go into our cylinder, and under the Transparency tab, I want to increase our global transparency to 100%. And then turn on our variable transparency, where we can customize a function. And for transparency production, right mouse click, go to Edit Function, and I'm going to add in a fractal. Change this to our open ocean. And now we're going to have something that matches up entirely to the water that we have on our other cylinder. But one thing we do need to do is increase our gain amount, because now we're working with a transparent surface. We need to increase this gain in order to get some nice patches, and so we don't have too much variation within our object. We'll go ahead and render out a quick render of this, and we can see that looks pretty good so far. But there are a couple of things we do need to change. One thing is the beams are a little too far apart, and in order for it to match up correctly with our water, what I do want to do is decrease the scale, and that way we have more beams casting through our object. So what we can do is go to our scale option and just reduce this down to, let's bring it down to 0.4, and I'm also going to deselect that cylinder and just reposition our camera a little. And we'll move this off to the side. And we'll go ahead and render that from another angle. And you can notice that we have a bit of grain showing up in our volumetric light. And we can really easily correct this. Now typically if you're using light gels or anything like that to cast shadows, then you're going to run into graininess problems that really can't be corrected. But in this case, with this type of object, all we need to do is go to our Edit Volumetric Settings, and in the Light Editor, increase our quality boost all the way up to 4. So let's go ahead and re-render that. And now we can see that all of that grain has disappeared. And we still had a very quick render. This rendered in about 13 seconds, which is not bad at all. But what I do want to do is just decrease that scale of that material once again. We'll go to 0.2. I'm also going to go to our spotlight and increase the spread, so we're covering a little more area. And then we do need to move that second cylinder to make sure that we are blocking that entire area. Now what I'll also do is just bring down the pitch a little bit more, and then I'm going to take our spotlight and we can match that up. But one thing I do want to do before I go ahead and make any adjustments to our light is link our cylinder to our light now that we have the correct material and everything set up. So under our last tab, which is going to be our motion animation tab, we can select link to spotlight. So now when we move our spotlight, that is going to move with it. And if I rotate our spotlight, that cylinder is also going to rotate correctly with it. And I'm going to go ahead and just point this down towards our scene, which doesn't match up entirely, but the position of the light itself will, because we are going to have a little bit of an angular change throughout that. Go ahead and render it, and we can take a look. And that looks really neat so far. One thing we can do is, if we don't want these beams to be this intense, but we still want to have a lot of the volumetric settings and that overall volume light in our scene, what we can do is go back to that cylinder, our second one that we created for our transparency, go to Edit Function, and just decrease the gain a little. And what that's going to do is balance out our light beams a little bit more, and then they will blend together and not be so harsh. So there's a lot of different ways we can adjust this just by increasing and decreasing the gain. And now what I want to do is just create a quick preview render, a little bit of animation, so we can see how the light beams are matching up to each of our water surfaces. And one thing I do want to do is go into our first cylinder and edit that function, and under the intensity of our wind, I'm going to increase this to 3, which is going to be a little bit faster. And I'm going to do the same for our second cylinder on its transparency surface, so that they're matching up correctly. Intensity to 3, click OK, and OK again. Now, currently, we do not really have anything animated in our scene, so if I go to render a preview, nothing's going to happen. It's going to render one frame. So what I need to do is first hit F11 on the keyboard, which is going to bring up our animation timeline, and I'm going to drag our time slider to 5 seconds. So we'll just create a 5-second animation. And what I want to do is go to our ground plane, because this is basically something that's inactive. I'm going to end up deleting this. So let's go and select Add Position Keyframe for our ground. And now we have something setting the animation length. So once we render our preview, we will be able to see this. I'm going to go to our preview options, and I have our frame rate set to 15 frames per second. So we're typically, with television, to be 30 frames, film to be 24 frames, television outside of the US and other formats, PAL or NTSC depending, PAL would be 25 frames per second, NTSC would be 30, or 29.97 to be exact. I'm going to set this to 15, which is going to be half of 30 frames per second, which is going to be good enough to give us an idea of how this is going to look when it's animated and rendered out. I'm going to set the preview size to 4 times so we can see it a little bit better, and set our render quality to final, and I can click OK. And now it's going to render out 15 frames per second, so 15 times 5, so we have 5 seconds. And I'm going to let these render out, these 76 frames, and then we can take a look at the motion throughout our scene. And now we can see our preview playing right now. I'm going to go ahead and stop this so we can scrub through. It's going to be a little bit easier to see with the difference of frame rate between the animation and the recording. But if we just scrub through, we can see that the light beams are moving along exactly in place with our water, which gives a really neat looking effect. And now if you want to have something a little more random, some of the areas disappearing, we can of course modify some of the other settings. And mainly we'd want to do that within our shadow object. Let's go ahead and go back to our first frame. Because any modifications we're going to be making, we want to make sure we're doing it at frame 0. And that way we're not creating an animated surface or an animated keyframe surface. So in other words, since we are using the OpenOcean, we edit our function, and we are connected to time, this is animated. But if I was to drag this to a later frame, maybe frame 15, and make a change, it would modify these keys throughout the animation, adjusting some of these settings that we really don't want to change. So one thing I am going to do is increase our choppiness value. And I can also decrease our largest feature just a little bit. And we can scrub through and render out just an individual frame right now. Take a look. And we can see how adjusting those values really broken our beam up a lot more. And it's going to give us a little more of an interesting animation. So let's go ahead and just render out another preview of this so we can take a look at how this is going to look over time. And now we can see a little more variation in the animation, but it still matches up correctly with our water. And I'm going to go ahead and just scrub through here, and we can see that just a little bit better. And now also, if we wanted to increase the intensity of each of these beams, we can go to our spotlight and increase our power. And that is going to make much brighter beams in our scene. We could also go to the volumetric settings and increase that intensity as well. Because the difference between the two intensities is adjusting our power is basically going to make the light intensity on objects in the scene much brighter, whereas just adjusting our volumetric setting will keep that overall light intensity down on our other objects. So we can edit our volumetric setting and just increase our intensity a little, and now we can see those brighter beams, but that's specifically for our volumetrics and not for how it's going to be influencing the objects within the scene. And what we can also do is add other objects into our scene which will cast shadows within these light beams. And what I'm going to do is just add an object in underneath this, so we'll be able to see that sort of an effect. And I'm just going to use a sphere, just a simple object, to demonstrate this. Increase the scale of this. And we just want to place this underneath our light beams and sort of in them. And now I'm going to render out another preview. And if we take a look at the preview, we can see that our sphere is casting shadows within that volume. Go ahead and stop that. We can scrub through. We can just see that breaking the beams. And we end up with a very good looking effect that we have. Go ahead and render out another full-size frame. And the effect that we're seeing on the sphere right now is caused by our extra light and the light beams. So what we can do if we need to remove that overall effect on other objects, because if we just want to see the light beams and we don't want that interaction directly on the object, we can go to our spotlight, edit volumetric settings, which is going to open up our light editor. And under influence, we can select all objects except the ones marked below, which means we can select any of these objects that we do not want to be affected. So I can select our sphere, and now that sphere is no longer affected by that light. And it looks like that was not the solution to the problem, which means that if we take a look at the sphere, we can see that the surface is the same one that we have for our shadows, and that carried over. So really, that effect was not caused by the light, and just by the fact that that surface will carry over. So now that we're re-rendering with just the default surface, we can see that it does look correct, and we don't have to worry about that. And go ahead and close that out. And now most light beams underwater are not going to be a direct and following line along with our water. Typically we would have a little bit of variation where the beam kind of cuts in and out. And there's a really easy way we can simulate that. And we're going to be using that cylinder once again that we used for our shadow. And basically what I want to do is just copy using Control-C and then Control-V to paste. I want to make sure I'm on the local coordinates, and I'm just going to move this up towards our light a little. So now we have two shadow objects. I'm also going to double click on the surface and just call this default 2, just so there's no confusion back and forth between our different surfaces, because if we change one and it has the same name as another, we can run into some problems. Probably could give this a better name, but for right now, default 2 will work fine. I'm going to go into edit function for our transparency, and what I want to do is use our open ocean and change the direction. And I'm going to be changing this to 180 degrees. And that way we're going to have our wind blowing the opposite direction and cutting across through our other shadows. And that's going to create some really nice variations in our beam coming in and out. So what I want to do is just go ahead and create a quick preview of this, and then you'll be able to take a look at that effect, still with our sphere in the scene. And now we can see the preview playing. I'm going to go ahead and stop that so we can scrub through. But we can see all the nice changes with our light beams coming in and out in some of the different areas. And it creates a much more realistic looking effect, because of course we're not going to have those constant beams that are continually flowing, and we do want them breaking apart for the most realistic looking effect. Because one thing the first shadow object that we have doesn't really take into account is the overall depth of our water waves going up and down, and their different directions, and of course the way they will refract light. So this is a way to sort of fake that effect, and it ends up looking really quite good. And if we just render a quick frame of this, we can see that overall it looks really, really good, and we don't have to worry about any conflicting lines or anything because of our different shadow objects. Now, one thing you may notice, I'm going to go ahead and close this out, we can kind of see these shadows objects through the water, and that can present a couple of problems. So what I'm going to do is go to our first cylinder, our first shadow object, and turn on only shadows. Click OK. go to our second shadow object, and turn on only shadows. Go ahead and render out a quick frame of this. And now the object itself isn't really showing up, although we can see the shadow that the object itself is casting onto our water, which we can see up at the top here. And that could also be a reflection of our sphere. So let's go ahead and just remove our sphere and delete that and render another frame, just so that we can really break it down and see exactly what's causing what in our scene. And now we can definitely tell the majority of that was not a reflection. So a few things you might have to take into account while you're working on this, and whether or not you want to have this object visible within the scene. Because of course if we turn off some of the different lighting settings, whether or not we want to affect this object, then we're going to lose our light beams altogether. So what I can do is take first our cylinder 3, which is our new shadow, and track or link to our spotlight, and that way we can move our spotlight and have that go along with it. And now if I set this a little bit out of the scene and maybe angle this down a little more and then render this out, we can see that we're still getting really good light beams, but we don't have that object showing up in the scene or affecting the shadows within our visible area. So just a little positioning, but still keeping with the same direction for the most part. That's an easy way we can get rid of that showing up. And if we take a look at some of our other volumetric options, I'm going to go ahead and right mouse click, edit volumetric settings, and now we also have show smoke or dust in light beam. I'm going to use our default right now, which is the surface that comes up immediately, and change this to 0.2 for size on all of our axes, and click OK. And then we can go ahead and render out another frame. And now we can see all those little shadows showing up. But of course the overall size might be a little too low now. I'm going to go back and set this to 0.8 instead of all the way down to 0.2. And render out another frame. And that looks a little bit better. And this is a good way to simulate particles and different bits of matter floating in our water. Right now the effect might be a little bit too high. So what we can do is go back to our volumetric setting, and under our filter, click and drag all the way to the lower left, create a new key point, and just bring up that left side. And that will dim down the effect quite a bit, and removing some of those shadowed areas, but still adding a bit of variation. And we can just kind of pull that left part of our filter up and down in order to adjust the total amount of that effect that we'd like to see. And right now, while this is rendering, we can see that might be set a little bit too low now, because we're really not seeing too much of the effect. So I can always go back and bring that down a little bit more. So I'll just go ahead and hit escape to cancel the render. Edit our volumetric setting, go to our filter, and just drag this down a little bit further, but not nearly as far as it was before, where it was all the way down, and creating too much of our shadows and really breaking up the beam for the black areas of our filter. And basically that was removing our beam entirely, where we just want to have a subtle light change in some of those areas and not necessarily be removing any full beams of light. And it already looks better, we can tell by looking at the render. So this is definitely something that would be usable within one of our scenes. Now let's take a look at removing that line that's showing up, basically when we reach the end of our cylinder that we have. And if we select that cylinder, and we take a look, transparency, I can increase our murkiness value. But really that's just going to take care of some of the direct areas. And once again, we can still see the line showing up. So there's a couple of things we can do. One thing we can do is just make sure our scene is above that horizon line, and our camera is always pointing above that. So if you have a scene that's just going to be looking directly up at that water, this is something you're not going to have to worry about at all. You just want to have those light beams showing through. You can still see the sky through our water, provided we go back to that cylinder and decrease the murkiness just a little bit more, so that we can actually see that. And now we can see the sun showing back up. And that looks pretty good. Now, if we're not going to be using any spectral clouds in the scene, one easy fix, just to change that to a volumetric model. Go to our fog and haze, remove our haze entirely and our fog. And now if I go ahead and render out a quick frame, we can see that the line has disappeared, and it is going to work out pretty well. I am going to bring our murkiness level down a little bit more, so we can start to see the ground plane. Of course, we're not going to have as bright of a sky, but if we're going to be angled in this direction where we're kind of looking into the scene anyway, that's really not going to matter too much. Although we may have to go to our light tab and increase the lighting gain, just so we can brighten up the ground plane a little bit more. We could always adjust our light balance, make it just a little bit brighter. Go ahead and render out quick frame. And now we can see that showing up. And we can also see all the shadows on our ground plane, which show up pretty well. Now if we wanted to add a couple of things to the scene, we can take a look at just kind of making a little rock structure. And there's one way I like to do this. First I'm just going to add in just one of our rocks. I'm going to go ahead and scale that up a little bit. And now if I go over to the left and use the drop object, it'll drop it onto our ground plane. And we could also use the smart drop. So first what I want to do is move this up a little, and I'm going to copy and paste and just move this off to the side. We can give a little bit of rotation to it, add in a new rock object, change that to scale, scale that up, and we can move that over. I'm going to set this to the global coordinates and turn that off of local. We can copy and paste that, move it over, give a little bit of rotation, and scale that up. And we can just do this a bunch of times to create some overlapping rocks that we'll have. Move that. And we just want to make sure that none of these rocks are really touching right now. And then what I'm going to do is start with our bottom rock and right mouse click on the drop object, which is going to give the smart drop option. And we'll just do this for all of our different rocks. And that way we can pile them up on top of each other and end up with a really neat looking effect. Now the scene's really dark right now, And we can see there's a couple of OpenGL display errors where it does look like our cylinder is just slightly above the ground plane. And that really depends on how we zoom in and out, but it is not affecting the overall scene. I'm going to go to our atmosphere editor, our sun, and we can adjust the direction of our sunlight. Make it a little bit brighter. Increase the lighting gain. And if we want to use global illumination or ambient occlusion, we can turn those on and change our lighting from sunlight to ambient. But this is something really nice that's going to block our beams. And then we can take the current rock texture and we could load in something else that's available that might fit more of an underwater scene. We've got rocks and landscapes that we can use. I'll go ahead and change this to the rocks and plants. And then we'll want to brighten that up a little bit. We can increase the artificial ambience and just kind of play around with those settings until it's a little bit brighter, because we are working with the volumetric model, and without fog and haze there's really not a whole lot of brightness to the atmosphere. So you may even have to use another light in order to create the lighting effects that you need without using the sunlight. So a couple things to keep in mind. And what we could also do is get rid of that ground plane, and we could just have a little bit of a terrain in there. And go ahead and move that into place. And move some of that below the ground plane. Just to add a little more variation. And then we could apply a different surface to that as well. And then you can always add an ecosystem to that, and it's all going to react really nicely to our overall scene. One thing to keep in mind with this technique that we have, I'm just going to delete these rocks and we're going to take a look at the terrain, and I just want to add a bit of an ecosystem to this, just so we can see some of the problems you might run into. I'm just going to load in one of the corals I'd created. And now if I go and click populate, with just our default, nothing is going to show up. If we go to density, turn off decay near foreign objects, and then populate, we will be able to see the object showing up. So decay near foreign objects is not going to work with this cylinder that we have for our water, and it will prevent any of our objects showing up because it is a foreign object. One thing we could do is move that water out of the scene, or just move it up a bit when we populate if you do need to use that decay near foreign object option, because of course it can be very useful. So what we can always do is take our cylinder and just move that up, and now it's no longer going to be an object that is a foreign object within the field of our population for our ecosystem. So just one thing to keep in mind while you're using this technique.